We found time and time again the best use case of LLMs is to what we call bullshit.
Bullshit.
Like just bullshit that you deal with in your life. Like AI is amazing for that. We saw that software is eating the world. It definitely ate practice of writing. You would never write a blog post or a book by hand or by a typewriter anymore. Yet reading was relatively untouched. Like everyone else, we're waiting to see if the next paradigm shift is with agents and agent-based models basically going and performing even more bullshit if you think about how much time you spend on your computer just clicking little boxes and now being able to instruct an artificial intelligence to go and do a lot of that work for you. I think that could just be the next game changer.
Welcome to Building with AI, the show where we engage in conversations with world-class AI product builders and leaders. We help uncover tactical insights to help you build and scale better AI products. I'm your host, Haroon Choudery, and today I'm joined by Dan Dayon, the founder of Readwise, a platform that enhances memory retention from reading by providing an all-in-one solution for managing digital content. Launched in 2018, Readwise has grown rapidly. Last year, Readwise ventured into the world of AI by launching Ghostreader, their AI reading assistant. During this episode, Dan talks about the UI and UX challenges he faced when designing AI products, the feature that unexpectedly became a fan favorite, Readwise's plans for the future, automating BS jobs, and much more. I was especially excited for this episode, being a longtime Readwise and Reader user, so I hope you enjoy it. But before we dig in, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
Autoblocks is the leading AI evaluation platform for product teams. It enables your team to collaboratively iterate on prompts, model parameters, and RAG parameters, while letting you retain full control over whatever frameworks or tech stack you want to build with. Seamlessly run tests to evaluate the impact of product changes on quality. Learn how to ship more reliable LLM products at autoblocks.ai. Now, back to the episode.
Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. Well, I'm very excited for this episode because I am a Readwise user for a very long time and was in a private beta for Reader, which I'm sure we'll dig into at some point as well. But for folks who aren't familiar with you or what you're working on, can you provide a quick introduction?
Sure. So I am one of the founders of a company called Readwise. We've been around for about 7 years. We make consumer software for what we call elite nonfiction readers. That started with our first products, which most people who have heard of Readwise are familiar with. It makes it easy to aggregate all your highlights from all your reading platforms like Kindle or Apple Books or Google Play Books, and article platforms like Instapaper and Pocket and Medium. Get all those highlights into one place and then get value out of them. For most people, that's actually going back and revisiting those highlights. It helps you remember what you've read, because a lot of us have this pain point of having invested 10 hours in reading a book and a month later you can barely recall the title, nevertheless key takeaways. And we also make it easy to get those highlights into these modern note-taking applications. It started with Evernote, but now you've got Notion and Obsidian and Roam Research. That's where we started. That product is still out there. And in addition, we built a second sophomore product, which you just mentioned, Reader, which is our reading application, which makes it easy to get all your content into one place. Digital reading is very fragmented right now. What I mean by that is you might read an article in the web browser, a newsletter in your email client, a PDF in a PDF application on your desktop, RSS in a feed reader, EPUBs in a ebook platform and EPUB reader. We make a reading application that brings all that content into one place and then gives you some very powerful tools like first-class highlighting, annotating, tagging, AI features, which we'll get into, and a whole lot more.
Awesome. Thanks for the overview, Dan. And I'm curious to learn about the company trajectory. So how long has the company been around, and what's the team size? And just sort of walk us through the journey leading up to the ChatGPT moment when everyone discovered the power of LLMs and wanted to rush to implement them into products. Sort of walk me through the journey of Readwise from the beginning to the incorporation of AI to where it is today.
Sure. So we're a very mission-driven company. Our mission internally is to improve the practice of nonfiction reading by an order of magnitude, aka 10x, using software. We looked at the world and we saw that software is eating the world. It definitely ate practice of writing. You would never write a blog post or a book by hand or by a typewriter anymore. Yet reading was relatively untouched. And this is back in 2017 when my co-founder Trisha and I decided to start working on Readwise. We couldn't come up with any first principles explanations for why that had to be the case. We just felt like there wasn't enough innovation to make it worth switching from paper to software. So because we're mission oriented, we have a very long-term approach. When we started the company, it did not make sense to raise venture capital for that vision. The market just isn't big enough for consumer SaaS. So we made the decision to bootstrap the company, i.e. build a product that users would pay for, and then recycle that revenue to grow the company. We started adding team members in 2020. That's when things really took off for us for a variety of reasons. We're now a team of 20 people, but we were building our reading application Reader. We were still in private beta when we started to become aware of the potential of large language models. And going back to the mission, the reason I brought that up is AI is very exciting for reading and for our mission because large language models work on text and we work with text. That's what a reading application does. And for the first time, now we have a really effective weapon or tool to make the practice of reading even better using software and really convince people to switch their reading from paper to software.
And so I'm curious to dig into some of those use cases for AI and a read later tool like Reader. And a lot of people don't know this, but for my newsletter that I've run for many years, Notabot, I've been using Reader since the private beta days to actually summarize all of the different articles that I stumble across that are related to AI. And so Reader will summarize those, I believe, using the feature called Ghostreader. And I'll use those summaries and modify them and add my own sort of voice to them and then share them with the audience, over 50,000 people. So it's a very instrumental part of my workflow for that reason. But I'm curious, like, what are some of the other use cases and AI features that resonate with your users?
Yeah, so we actually started incorporating LLMs into Reader before ChatGPT. So we started with the GPT-3 completion model, if you remember that, in third quarter 2020. So it was kind of funny to do all this work and incorporate GPT-3 and then have ChatGPT come out and completely pull the rug out from underneath us. That's something we can get into. But to answer your question about use cases, I'll be completely honest. We're still in the tinkering, trial and error, experimentation mode of trying to figure out what are the killer use cases. We know what they are with writing, right? Like generative AI is extremely powerful when it comes to writing. For example, you writing your newsletter or countless people removing a lot of the drudgery of having to write. But while you're reading, while similar, it is a completely different context. And so there's still a lot of exploration and innovation to be had. The cheeky name for our suite of AI features is Ghostreader. That's a play on Ghostwriter, which was a really popular show in America in the 1990s on PBS. I don't know if you remember that, about reading. So it felt like we were honoring that show by calling it Ghostreader. The initial use cases that we made were basically enabling you to invoke handcrafted prompts that we had written. Back when GPT-3 existed before ChatGPT, getting it to do what you wanted required a lot of skill in writing the right prompt, which at the time was too hard to teach to users. So we just did the work of trying to come up with really cool prompts and then enabling users to invoke them before you read, while you read, or after you read. So to give you some examples, you can select a word or phrase while you're reading and then feed that into a handcrafted prompt. We take the text from the document, feed it into a prompt in order to get a cool response. Some of the use cases there would be, say, defining a word. That's a really cool thing you can do while you're reading digitally that you can't do while reading on paper. And yeah, you can look up a word in Kindle or just select a word on iOS and it'll reference a dictionary like Merriam-Webster or something. But GPT can do it even better because, for example, it can know how the word is being used in context. So many words have multiple definitions when you look up them in the dictionary and you have to decide like, oh, this is the fourth definition. GPT just shortcuts that and explains how it's being used in context. You can also tweak the output to get it the type of definition that you're looking for. Like maybe you're interested in etymology and the history of the word, or maybe you want it to provide an example of the word being used. GPT is also basically Wikipedia in a box. So if you come across a historical figure or a place or a concept, you can just invoke GPT-3 to do an encyclopedia lookup. That's on the word or phrase level. There are a couple other examples, but that hopefully gives you a flavor. You can also invoke it on the sentence or the paragraph level. You might, the most popular one when we launched this back in 2022 was simplification. People were devouring research papers trying to make sense of AI, and you'd often come across a very dense, hard to unpack paragraph. And to help kind of like ease yourself into it, you might be able to select that paragraph and then invoke a prompt to simplify it, which would rewrite it in simpler terms, which isn't necessarily going to give you the deepest understanding, but at least it might like help you climb the learning curve a little bit. And then you could invoke Ghostreader on the document level. By far, the most powerful use case of using AI while reading, well, I wouldn't say while reading, before reading, is summarization. Like even Sam Altman himself says that that's his most powerful use case in that interview with Patrick Collison. So we've invested a lot in summarizing every document that you save, whether it's an article or a PDF or a book, you get a nice summary. In the latest iteration of Ghostreader, we call it Ghostreader V2, you can actually go in and customize that prompt and really get it to produce the kind of output that you want. We can talk about this in depth, but when we originally did Ghostreader, it was using the GPT-3 completion prompt, which required a lot of skill, like I mentioned, which users didn't have at the time. But since ChatGPT is so popular, fastest growing consumer application of all time, everyone at this point who's interested in AI has probably read 10 Twitter threads about how you're using ChatGPT wrong and now kind of like understands how to interface with an LLM. And because users now get that, now it makes sense for us to expose that flexibility to the users and make a higher bar feature. That is, I think, if you step back and think about it, one of the most compelling aspects of generative AI is its flexibility. It takes a creative person, but you can apply it to so many different use cases, and to abstract that away from the user, we felt like was a mistake. So now enabling users to go and craft these prompts themselves rather than having to just select from the ones that we wrote.
When you were initially constructing some of those prompts that were available by default in Ghostreader, what was the process of iterating on those prompts to make sure that they were maximally, or that they were as useful as possible to the users? Was it a iterative process, experimental? Did you take user feedback into account? I'm curious how you shaped that and how it evolved over time as well.
Yeah, so we look to first replicate a lot of existing functionality and features that we would have had to have manually built. Like we always knew we wanted a define feature. We always knew we wanted an encyclopedia feature. These are table stakes features in really nice, like fully built out reading applications. GPT went and simplified that for us dramatically because now we could deliver those in one feature rather than having to find a dictionary to download, embed it into the app, and then build a lookup feature, build an encyclopedia. So for those features, which were just table stakes, that was relatively simple. In terms of more innovative features, one of the nice things about working on a consumer product in contrast to a B2B or enterprise product is everyone on the team is an avid user of the software, like truly a user, not just kind of like a testing user. So most of our trial and error experimentation product process for the handcrafted Ghostreader prompts was just internally, like, what do we find ourselves wanting to do? When I'm reading a really intense fantasy book where the author has imagined this crazy world, I often come across a place or a character who I forget who that is. I want to be able to select that place or that character and then look it up. Behind the scenes, what's going on is you might select a word like in Lord of the Rings, like Mordor. We're going and searching the document for all mentions of Mordor, stuffing those sentences into a prompt, and then asking GPT, explain what Mordor is, right? Like we find ourselves wanting to do that. So there it was less user feedback than it was our team internally doing it. Now in our V2, this incorporates a lot of the feedback from users and the feedback, if you just boil it down, is I want to control, like I want to customize this for my specific use case.
And so when you mentioned these different mentions of Mordor and taking all of those mentions and stuffing them into a prompt, now when you were engineering this entire system and this workflow, who was involved? And also, I'm curious, like how is it different than maybe working on a feature that didn't require an LLM? So it's something that was like a traditional software feature, just so we have some contrast as to what makes AI development unique.
Yeah. So in terms of the team who was involved in this feature, it was mostly me on the product side, and then one of our very strong backend engineers who's just very interested in the whole AI, large language model space. And we initially did lots of experiments. The first thing that we wanted to do with LLMs that we worked on for a couple months was actually nothing to do with these features while you're reading, but mostly focused on recommendations. Like that's another powerful application of LLMs in the reading space is you can turn each document, you can embed it into a vector and then find similar documents and then use that to fuel recommendations. Turned out that's a very, very hard problem, even though LLMs dramatically simplify it. It might take 5 data science PhDs and 5 engineers beforehand to create a very powerful recommendation feature, whereas now 1 or 2 strong engineers can do it. So we decided to put that on ice and revisit it later and focus more on tools that improve the actual practice of reading. And then from a technical perspective, one of the things we do, which we're now exposing to users, but one of the cool things that we did internally to accelerate our product iteration cycle and experimentation, because we're in such a frontier zone where no one really knows what's going to work and what's not, is we built a templating language. So that's basically how Ghostreader worked behind the scenes. Now it's not behind the scenes. Now users can see it. So if I want to write a prompt, I'm like the lead prompt whisperer on our team. I could write a prompt that then has these variables. So it might have document title, and it will go and replace when the prompt renders before it goes off to, we're using OpenAI, but you could use whatever model. That document title will be replaced with, say, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, or it could say document content or document author, or we built subroutines that would go and search. So it would go and search for all mentions of the word Mordor. So we built that templating language because after a while we discovered that this would be the fastest way to figure out the cool prompts. And that's what we're exposing to users in Ghostreader V2 and making that a little bit better.
Yeah. And I'm curious, so this development workflow that you have, you on the product side, working with technical folks and not only changing things like prompt and the system, but also just rewiring and experimenting with different workflows across the retrieval stage to prompting stage. Does this feel different than traditional software development in any way? I'm curious, what about it is similar? What about it is different, given that you have these LLMs that are kind of unpredictable. They're magical, but they're also kind of unpredictable. I'm curious how you contrast it with other features that Reader and Readwise has worked on that didn't involve LLMs.
Yeah, that's a good question. From a technical perspective, I actually don't think it's that different than other features we build Where it's really different for us is just everything is so risky. Everything is so experimental. And so we typically like to build features that we know 100% are going to work and we don't waste time. Whereas here, there's so many attempts that don't work out. And combine that with the fact that the landscape is shifting so rapidly. I mentioned that our first iteration of this was using GPT-3 completion model before ChatGPT even existed. That kind of like dropped a bomb and made what we had built in some ways look like a toy for a little bit. That's how it's different. So for us, it's more on the strategy side, I would say, than the actual stochastic unpredictability nature. Now, there are like examples of how LLMs being unpredictable will annoy us. For example, the summary feature that was because it was so risky and because the landscape was shifting so quickly, we decided not to rapidly iterate on Ghostreader and maybe let the dust settle a little bit. We were actually hoping that other companies would go and do R&D. You know, some company with the domain name like .ai would go and figure out some cool UI UX innovation that we could just borrow inspiration from, so we didn't have to take all the arrows in the back. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that was our hope. And so in 2023, we're like, all right, let's focus on the low risk AI features. So summaries are where we really invested because they're really nice and we know they create value. They're more of like a 1 to 10 feature than a 0 to 1 feature, but we know they create value no matter what. And one of the frustrations we get with the stochastic nature is GPT has this very strong tendency to respond in English. Even though many of our users are international, they're trying to summarize a document in a non-English language, and yet GPT will respond with the summary in English. Getting GPT to not do that is actually a pretty hard problem. The most reliable way to do it is to write the prompt in the target language that you want it to respond in. So if someone is summarizing a document in German, you want the instructions sent to GPT to be in German, and that's the best way to kind of coerce it to responding in German. And again, this goes back to exposing the actual prompt itself to the user rather than us handcrafting it and then letting the German users rewrite that prompt in German, and now they get the exact summary that they want.
And so are you collecting feedback from the users where the AI features are maybe not working appropriately, and then you're using that to make fixes? Is that sort of what the workflow looks like? Is it starts with maybe something a user had pointed out, and then that becomes a test case for you to iterate on internally?
Yeah, I mean, our product is still in beta, so we're receiving dozens, if not hundreds of pieces of feedback per day, some of which is about Ghostreader and the AI features. So we're collecting that and trying to figure out how to best address that holistically. And yeah, getting these Ghostreader responses in an undesired language is a very common piece of feedback, which then we have to figure out, like, all right, how do we address that?
So you talked a little bit about the predictability of these outputs. Sometimes you just can't predict how well they're going to do at adapting to different languages, for example. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges that you experienced during the development of some of those LLM-based features?
Yeah, the primary one by far is coming up with the right UI, UX for interfacing with LLMs. There's all this anticipation that there's going to be this new interface, but up until now, I still think that the only killer interface that has been innovated is chat. And so there's a strong tendency to want to try and go and put chat into the product. Like, how do we chat with a document? I'm sure you've been on Twitter or X, whatever you call it, and seen all these indie hackers talking about their chat with PDF app. And we cannot make sense of that whatsoever. It does not fit into our product. I don't know who is using this chat with PDF product. Maybe it's like a completely different reading use case than what our users do. Like maybe people are uploading like contract PDFs and querying specific questions. But for us, we have not been able to figure out how to make chat work whatsoever. It's got a couple core problems. First, it really only works on web, right? Because you need to have the document on one side and then the chat going on the right side. And if you try and do that on mobile, there's no way to have the chat coexist next to the text. Instead, you need to occlude or hide the text, which is just really janky and not fun at all. And then assuming that you did or were able to solve that problem on mobile, there's another problem where chat really breaks the reading flow. If you're trying to like read a document, like there's this period where you like ramp up into a flow, right? Like it takes like a minute or 3 minutes, depending on the complexity of the document, where you really get into a rhythm of reading the document, taking a highlight, adding a note here. Whereas chat is just really distracting. If you're on web, like you're in the document, and then you move your eyes to the right, and then you do some stuff over there, and then you move to the left and you've lost your place. Like it just really is disruptive. And if you think about it from kind of a first principles perspective, it doesn't really make sense, because reading is kind of like going to a college lecture where you have someone who's taken all this time to try and condense knowledge into a document that can be read in a linear format. Like I'm going to walk you up this learning curve, just like a college course progresses, right? And if you went to a course and someone was putting their hand in the air the entire lecture and interrupting with like random questions, no one would ever learn. So we've really, really struggled. Don't get me wrong. We've tried to figure out how do we make chat work inside the document, and we cannot figure it out. I think where users are coming from, and I could be wrong, but I think the desire for chat when that request comes, kind of like if I asked users what they want, they'd ask for a faster course. I think the underlying desire for faster transportation here is the flexibility. They're saying like, hey, I have this specific question and a specific use case, and these pre-built prompts are not doing it. I want like the complete flexibility to do what I want.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. We hear that quite often on this show. A lot of folks that are building AI-powered products talk about the difficulty of just UI and UX, because it's the entire experience, right? It's all sort of part of the package. And what you're describing about the chat experience being distracting when you're in the flow state while reading, it resonates a lot. For what it's worth, I think the interface in Reader, where I think you can summon Ghostreader using the command palette, Command K, is pretty intuitive. But glad that you guys are thinking about it, because it is definitely an important challenge. What has been the most surprising thing about working on AI features for so long? You mentioned that you were previously working with the GPT completions model before ChatGPT was released. So over the course of the past couple of years, what has been the most surprising learning that you've had working on some of these LLM-based features?
Yeah, so throughout this, we've been focused on kind of the large language models like GPT. I've forgotten to mention that the other very powerful application of generative AI in Reader has been text-to-speech. So that is taking just some raw text and then turning it into human-like spoken word. And you asked what the biggest surprise is. I think the biggest surprise has been the demand for that feature. That could just be a product in and of itself. It's so heavily demanded. We have some users who only use Reader for that. And yeah, we knew that people like listening to audiobooks. Audiobooks grow a lot, but we did not realize like just how much pent up demand there was to be listening to documents throughout the day rather than reading them with your eyes.
To me, it completely makes sense, because I use the listen feature all the time. I use it sometimes while I'm on the treadmill. I just queue up a bunch of articles. I hit the play button and I'm able to just ingest so many more articles that way. I'm dropping my daughter off at daycare. I'm listening to articles on Reader. It's such a useful feature. And I think part of what makes it useful is that the voice is pretty realistic. Like it doesn't sound robotic at all, like the old school versions of this, right? Like other companies have tried this in the past, maybe before things like Whisper were available, and it just was not the most pleasant experience. And yeah, I mean, I think it just makes sense to live in the Reader application as well, because that's already the place where you're sending everything to. just having everything in the right place. Yeah, I end up flying through articles that way.
We also, just to add to that, there's people who listen hands-free while on the treadmill. There's another use case, which is pretty interesting, which, I don't know, we refer to it internally as immersion reading. And this is another use case that I don't think we predicted, which is people want to listen and read at the same time. And it's kind of like a sensory deprivation chamber where you're overloading your senses. I think it makes sense in a distracted world where like we're so anxious to go on like social media or addicted to our phones, but you'll get the voice coming through your ear, and then you'll be watching the word track as you read. It's another really interesting way of reading that didn't exist before.
As another data point, that's something that I do for audiobooks and for longer articles. And I think in a world where our attention spans are just getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, if I can identify that something is worthwhile for me to read, I will put myself in that sort of environment where it's a difference between watching a movie in your home living room. You end up absorbing a lot less in the living room, and it's the same thing with books. So that also checks out quite nicely. As a user, one of the ways that I think about the value of a tool like Reader is I don't necessarily think about articles that I save as articles necessarily. I think about different topics. So Reader becomes a place that I store all of those articles, and then I can establish the taxonomy and the categories for helping cluster them into different tags, right? Just to add some organization as to what these things are about. But I'm curious if the team is thinking about making it easier to group different related articles more seamlessly by the topics automatically generated. And also, Ghostreader right now works on the article level. I'm curious if there's ambitions to extend that to a category level where you can maybe ask questions across all articles that you've stored that are about building startups, for example, right? So I have a category of startup related articles. And for me, it'd be pretty incredible to be able to just search across all those articles. I feel like that would be so much more powerful than ChatGPT because these articles are already vetted by me. Like I know that these are probably worthwhile for me to read, and the general understanding of a large language model. And then on top of that, you have this layer of custom content that you have already vetted to base it on. So I'm curious, like how the Reader team thinks about that.
Yeah. So there were a couple questions there. I think the first one, before getting into, operating on a collection of documents, was, do we think about ways to make it easier to kind of group similar documents? So we remove some of the tediousness of organizing, which you have to do manually now. You need to come up with the taxonomy yourself, and then you need to remember to apply the tag and apply it to the right document. We've done a lot of experiments in this place. It's definitely a problem and definitely something we hope to solve. As I mentioned, when our first idea for how to incorporate LLMs into Reader before we did Ghostreader was actually building a system that would take each document, embed it into a vector, put it into vector. This is how historically you do kind of that clustering. Then you find the documents that are most similar to one another. We've also got a new experiment running. You can actually test it in the app yourself if you want, which comes at it from a completely different approach. So not to get too technical here, maybe like a 6 out of 10, but the classic way of using AI to group documents is the approach I talked about. You take the text and then you try and find which texts are most similar to one another. You might use a technique known as like TF, IDF or vectors, and then do cosine similarity, and then you cluster them. Then once you have these clusters, the boundaries of them figured out, then you do a second step that tries to label it and try and come up with like a good term. So, maybe startups and entrepreneurship, and then you have one on large language models, what have you. That's the classic approach. It's computationally efficient. It's very fast, but it's a lot of engineering to get it to work. it's possible that GPT-4 and advanced models might just enable us to drop like a nuclear bomb on this and come at it from a completely different approach and skip over all of that. So in Reader right now, there's actually an ability to use Ghostreader to apply a tag to the document using a prompt. And you can go and write your own prompts as to how to tag this. There are many different ways you could write that prompt. You could just let Ghostreader riff and say like, hey, write 3 tags for this. The problem there is that it will randomly pick tags, and whereas you want the tags to be the same most of the time. The most effective prompt we found is what we call, to use the word you used, a taxonomy-driven prompt. So if you're willing to take a little bit of time and figure out what topics are important to you and develop that into a taxonomy, you can stuff that into a prompt. And so you can be like just to use a very general purpose one, you can have one that's like entertainment and health and fitness and philosophy and work document. And then you write a little description of what each of those is. And then you feed the document into that prompt. GPT is really good at responding with the right label from that set that you gave it with the explanation of what those are. So that's the first question on topic modeling or tagging or clustering. It's still very experimental and we're still figuring out how to make it better, but you can go and play with it now. Then I think your second question was, is there a vision to use Ghostreader not so much at like a word or phrase or a paragraph or a document level, but now go to like collections of documents? And the answer is definitely yes. We just view that as another scope. We think about these in like scopes of prompts. One of the coolest ways you can do that, we just came back from a team offsite in Norway last week. And at our offsites, we always have a hackathon. One of our engineers made a hack where we call it document synthesis. So you can synthesize a document using an existing document. So you might take a recipe and synthesize it into, I'm sure you've read like a recipe blog post. It comes with all the, background story of like, grandma making borscht in 1942 or whatever. And you might want that recipe to always be in a consistent format and kind of skip over the fluff and whatnot. You can synthesize it, or you can translate a document from one language to another. You can also do synthesis in this experiment on a collection of documents. So let's say you're going on a trip we went to the fjords in Norway, and you collect 10 blog posts, right? And then you have that in a collection. And then you write a prompt that says, synthesize me a document with an itinerary or like a plan for what I should do while I'm there. And you tell it based on what I'm interested in. I hate museums, but I love going to like cool coffee shops and whatever, and it synthesizes the document for you. That's not so much like querying and asking a question of a collection, but one example use case that we played with. In terms of just the querying of a subset of documents, that would require creating a chat interface. We have done that with this podcaster, David Senra. Do you know him?
That's probably my favorite podcast right now. And I know he has his founder's notes, which he partnered up with you guys about. So yeah, I would love to learn a little bit more about how you're shaping that. I figured since he built it with Readwise and Reader, that was the perfect place for him to sort of expose it to chat interface. But yeah, excited to learn more about that.
Yeah, so that has a chat interface that works kind of like you're talking about. He calls it Sage. So you can go in there and you can be like, okay, I need to fire someone for underperforming, and it will go and find the relevant highlights and then feed them into a response that is not like generic GPT-4, right? Like kind of like a blah response. You can go and do that in ChatGPT and get like a pretty like milquetoast response. This is enhanced with like all the different books and highlights that he's read on business for those kinds of things. One challenge there is it requires users to have a lot of creativity to even ask those questions in the first place. So you kind of get back to the blank page effect where you need to tell users what to do. But yeah, we're doing some work there and trying to figure out how to do it right. I actually think that might be a good opportunity. I don't know if guests on your show have figured out how to use custom GPTs with ChatGPT and found like good killer applications there. I think that might be an actually good application for us, is enabling you to go into ChatGPT, connect your Readwise account, and then chat with your highlights being there.
I would definitely use that for what it's worth. I haven't used a lot of custom GPTs, but I would definitely use something like that. So Dan, based on your learnings with working with LLMs, what advice do you have to builders about building great AI products? What is the secret to building great AI products?
Oof, that's a tough question because I feel like I don't know the answer to it myself. We're all kind of on the frontier, experimenting, trying to figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, most people have the same reaction. But yeah, I mean, just based on, having worked with these technologies for so long, for as long as you possibly could have, right? Only a couple of years, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's, yeah, you've been working on it since the early days. What does it take to sort of find success here?
Yeah, well, I'll share one insight that we keep coming back to internally. I don't know if this insight is the key to building a $100 billion, open AI scale business, but in terms of being like an indie hacker or bootstrapped or just building like a good business with low risk, we found time and time again, the best use case of LLMs is to what we call bullshit. So if you can find ways to just kind of like just bullshit that you deal with in your life, like that seems to be when it's awesome. Like if I have to fill out a governmental form, like AI is amazing for that. If I have to write some rejection email to someone who just cold emailed me and the stakes are not very high, I would never do this with like someone that I actually have a personal relationship with, but that's a perfect application. Time and time again, that seems to be like just a reliable way to create value with AI in the immediate term where we are right now.
I love that advice. Find the things that people consider to be bullshit they don't want to do, and use AI to automate it and simplify it. I like it.
Yeah, I'm using that term bullshit, borrowed from this David Graeber book called Bullshit Jobs. There's this thesis that a lot of knowledge work that exists today is just mere paper pushing and doesn't really need to exist. It's not like genuinely productive. So I'm using it in that sense.
Yeah, it's funny when you say that, because a lot of people, when they think about, especially the early days of like ChatGPT and when LLMs really became popularized, they would say that LLMs create bullshit in terms of just, the hallucinations and all this sort of stuff. But it's a different framing, right? It's not necessarily in the quality of the outputs, but it's more so the quality of some of those jobs to be done that you can use AI to augment, which I like that framing a lot. So looking ahead into the future, what are you most excited about for Reader, for Readwise in general, and the industry at large with LLMs and other types of generative AI models?
Yeah, with Readwise and Reader, we built a very advanced kind of power user product where we have people reading, without exaggeration, 10, 20 hours a week, which is awesome if you just think about how much time that is of a person's like waking hours. And we're most excited about now democratizing that for a more mainstream user who may not have the habit of, saving articles to read later and the power user inclination. That's kind of how we started with the product. Like, let's go and make it work really well for power users and then find ways to extend that to other people. For the industry at large, I'm definitely very excited to see if OpenAI responds to Claude and Anthropic's models in the short term. We're kind of holding our breath, trying to decide if we should incorporate that. But yeah, I think like everyone else, we're waiting to see if the next paradigm shift is with agents and agent-based models, basically going and performing even more bullshit if you think about how much time you spend on your computer just clicking little boxes, and now being able to instruct an artificial intelligence to go and do a lot of that work for you. I think that could just be the next game changer.
Awesome. Where can people find you? Where can people find the products that Readwise is working on and stay up to date on all of the cool things that your team is working on?
Yeah, so Readwise is readwise.io. We actually acquired the .com, so you can go to readwise.com too and go to the website and then learn about the original Highlights product and then the more advanced Reader application. I only really am active on Twitter. My handle is deadly_onion, which is a respelling of Daniel Doyon, my name. So that's where you can find us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you as well.